Artivism is executive produced by ArtUp, hosted by Linda Steele, produced, directed, and distributed by KUDZUKIAN. Hi, this is Linda Steele, and you're listening to Artivism on the KUDZUKIAN Network. My guest today is Lecolion Washington, Executive Director of the Community Music Center of Boston in Boston, Massachusetts. Hi, Lecolion. How are you?
I'm doing well, Linda. Thanks for inviting me on the show.
Absolutely. So tell everybody, the listeners here, a little bit about your background. We know from the introduction that you're the executive director of the Community Music Center of Boston, but there is so much more to you and your background. So tell us a little bit more about you.
Sure. I was born and raised in the Dallas area, I grew up kind of your typical Texas, poor man's life. My parents were divorced when I was quite young, and so I spent, most of the time in my childhood with my mother and my sister.
Mm-hmm.
And we moved to Garland, Texas, when I was in fourth grade. And I'm going to fast forward a little bit. There was this pivotal moment when I was in sixth grade. The school that I attended was seized by the state,
mm-hmm.
and they kicked out essentially all the kids whose test scores were too high.
Wow.
So when I was going to my seventh grade year, my parents, who were divorced at the time, but they came together and they worked and essentially fought the school board to get me into this magnet school, because the magnet school didn't want to let me in because I was coming from this other school that had been seized by the state. And even though my test scores were high, they were like, if he came from that school, he's probably not going to be able to make it in this school.
Mm-hmm.
But I ended up getting into the school, and that was really a life-changing event for me because I was just around an entire network of people who were all college-bound. And it was, for the time, late 80s, it was a very diverse school as well. Much more progressive, I think, than any of the schools that I participated or went to even after that. So when I finished up I went through the junior high school, went through high school, ended up going to the University of Texas at Austin, Hook 'em Horns. That was I got my undergrad from there. And I originally started as a chemical engineering major when I went
didn't know that.
Yeah. When I started at UT, I was a chemical engineering major. I had been playing music in high school. I had been pretty good. I wasn't great. I never made All-State, although in Texas it's really difficult to make All-State.
Mm-hmm.
But I was never that good at it. I didn't really have access to to regular private lessons. I took some lessons, but not a whole lot. And so when I went to school, I was going to be a chemical engineering major. But I started playing the bassoon when I was there. And I just really missed not being in music land.
Mm-hmm.
And I really enjoyed the sciences, but right when I got there, very early, I switched my major to music. At the time, I wanted to be a band director. So I went from music education to bassoon performance, and I graduated from the University of Texas and went to the Manhattan School of Music for graduate school.
Now, tell us why the bassoon?
Well, actually, it's funny. My sixth grade band director, it was his choice. My dad wanted me to play saxophone. I wanted to be a drummer, but my band director said, you should try this thing out. I'm like, well, what the heck is that? And he's like, it's a bassoon. Well, fine. I guess I'll play that because it wasn't one of those things where I heard bassoon one day and it was the thing that I loved. It wasn't that at all. It was just like the band director had one and gave it to me. And my older sister, she had been in band. She played clarinet. And so I just assumed when you went to middle school, you were in band. But there wasn't this kind of thing where I went to a outreach concert or I went and heard the Dallas Symphony and I heard a bassoon and I knew the rest of my life that's all I wanted to do. That wasn't my story. It was just, hey, that's what they had. What you learn oftentimes in college, having been a music ed major, is you find a smart kid If you want to have a bassoon or an oboe or a double reed in your band, you find a smart kid, you give them the instrument and the fingering chart, and let them go to town on it. And I was fortunate that my band director was actually an oboist, so he had some background in bassoon playing, so he was actually able to help me quite a bit in that 6th grade year.
Mm-hmm. See, listeners, this is the type of guest that we have here on Artivism. Lecolion Washington, the executive director of the Community Music Center of Boston, is a musician, an artivist, an arts administrator, and we're talking to him today about his background and experience in music and the arts. So, Lecolion, tell me, we're, full disclosure, we know each other from another place.
Right, yeah, we do. And this is a great opportunity for me to be able to share just how important a role you played in the way that I view my own work.
Oh, thank you.
So I really want to plug that. So I finished up grad school. I started playing professionally. I taught bassoon at the University of Missouri, and then I got to the University of Memphis, where I became the bassoon professor there. Soon after getting tenure, I really wanted to start doing more work in the community.
And I read somewhere, Lecolion, that you became a full professor, tenured professor at the age of 33.
Yep, that's right. Yeah, I did.
That's amazing.
I was 33 when I was tenured, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. It was such a weird, and just a random aside, when I got my first position teaching at the University of Missouri, I was 26.
Oh.
So I was closer in age to the students that I was working with than I was with my colleagues. And so that was an interesting dynamic. And when I came to Memphis a couple of years later, again, I was 28. I'm a 28-year-old kid who has graduate students he's working with.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the same thing when I was a 26-year-old kid with graduate students. Some of them were older than I was. But I did have plenty of performance experience, and I had some teaching experience. So it was more just the age thing. I think people understood that I brought certain things to the table for sure. I think that everyone understood that. But anyway, that was, so once I got tenure, I started thinking, well, what else I'm 33 years old, I'm a tenured professor, so what do I do next? What else do I do? Is this it? And so that's when I really started getting into the community-based work and the organization, the PRIZM Ensemble, that's based in Memphis. That's when I really started to get more deeply into the work that PRIZM was doing in the community, which led me to you, led me to Linda Steele, who, PRIZM, my wife, Karina, who was doing a lot of the grant writing, she wrote a grant to be one of the first community engagement fellows that Linda had. So we were in that first class of community engagement fellows, and it really just changed my life because before that, we were, as an organization and me as an individual, was just kind of shooting in the dark. I had these things I wanted to give to the community, but I didn't really know how. And so really working with Linda in that fellowship really helped me to realize that I didn't have things to give. I had just as much to gain in that work. It was a very saviorist, my own perspective, even as a black man who grew up in an underserved community, was a very saviorist approach to it, and it was really centered around saviorism. And it was really the work that I did with the community engagement fellows that made me realize that when you're doing community engagement work, you're partnering with a community. And so you have probably more to gain than you have to give, and you have to walk into the conversation with that mindset.
Wow, exactly. You are listening to Artivism on the KUDZUKIAN Network, and today my guest is musician, artivist, activist, Lecolion Washington of the Community Music Center of Boston. So, Lecolion, we've been talking about your experience here in Memphis and the experience you had with PRIZM Ensemble. So let's talk more about that and social activism and the types of work that you got into here in Memphis.
Yeah, I would say that the first thing that I think that we were able to do was, and this was one of the pieces of the Community Engagement Fellowship, was we got an opportunity to listen. And that was part of the part of the process. So we got to learn about the history of Memphis. We got to learn about all these different communities. We learned about Soulsville neighborhood, and we learned about Orange Mound. And so it was for us, for me as an individual, and again for the organization as well, it really got us into these spaces where I think we didn't really occupy before. Although we had an interest, we didn't really have any stakeholders there. We didn't have people who, go-to people in Orange Mound the way that we ended up having later. And that was because one of the great things about that project was at the end we received support to start a program in Orange Mound, and it was great the way that it was done. There was this site called the Orange Mound Outreach Ministries, OMOM, OMOM, and they had a bunch of instruments in there inside the house where they had this after-school program, and they didn't have anyone to teach the young people how to play those instruments. And so we were like, oh, it's perfect. We're a music organization, so why don't we have a relationship with OMOM where we are actually fulfilling something that they want for their community, something that they want for their site, as opposed to us asking them to host a program. We really worked with them to create a program, and it was a really strong program. I think that from PRIZM's perspective, it really allowed us to be able to have a relationship with the Orange Mound community, which is what we did. So it wasn't just that we had the O Music project, which will be Orange Mound, O Music, OM. It was just we had that project. We really started to be partners in the community. So when there were events that were happening in Orange Mound, oftentimes they would reach out to us because they felt like we were their community partners. We were the community partners in that community. And that was, for us, very humbling, but also let us realize that saviorism idea doesn't really work, that you have to be a partner. You cannot ask an environment or a community to host your activity. You have to work with them. You can't walk in with a preformed project and think that it's going to be able to stick.
I was a big fan, and still am, of O Music. And listeners, you are listening to Artivism on the KUDZUKIAN Network. I'm Linda Steele, your host, and I'm talking to Lecolion Washington, the Executive Director of the Community Music Center of Boston. And when we return, we're going to talk more about music and music education and social activism and how those work together, and really how Lecolion is really the perfect person to talk about this.
Artivism on the KUDZUKIAN Network. KUDZUKIAN!
Hi, this is Lecolion Washington, Executive Director of the Community Music Center of Boston, and you're listening to Artivism on the KUDZUKIAN Network.
Hi, this is Linda Steele, and you're listening to Artivism on the KUDZUKIAN Network. And I've been having this fantastic conversation with Lecolion Washington, musician, artivist, arts administrator. And Lecolion is currently the Executive Director of Community Music Center of Boston. And we've been talking about his experiences in Texas and then in Missouri and Memphis, and really want to talk more about this experience in Memphis, but the topic of music education, and social activism. I really see the type of work that you've been doing as social activism, and I'd just like to talk to you about it. How is music education, social activism?
Well, there are several ways. Number one, I would say that it's not something that just happens because you give a kid a violin. I think there are some who think that just by its mere existence, music becomes a tool for social justice, or this way of being an activist. But I don't necessarily think that. I think it has to be intentional, and you have to say that this is our intent. Our intent is to bring certain things to light. Our intent is to make people think about these things. It's not something that's this ancillary impact of our work, but it's right in the middle of it. And so And the work that we started to do in Memphis, I think, was around that. I think that one of the things that we started to realize was that our board and our staff and even some of the students we were working with in a lot of our programs didn't represent and didn't reflect the city of Memphis. And so we really started to think a lot more about that and started to put metrics to ourselves to say, hey, Memphis is a city that is 65% black. Just black, not even people of color, right? I mean, it is a predominantly black city. And so I used to say all the time, if you walk into a place and you don't see any black people, it should be, it's by design. Right. Because it should be mathematically impossible, right? Like,
says the math chemical engineer major.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so we wanted to make sure that we were an organization that actually said that, and we're comfortable saying that. And I think that PRIZM did that, and it really helped the work that I was doing with the Memphis Music Initiative as well.
Yes, I wanted you to talk about MMI and that experience too. So tell our listeners a little bit more about MMI. We're talking to Lecolion Washington, Executive Director of the Community Music Center of Boston, and you're listening to Artivism on the KUDZUKIAN Network.
Yeah, the relationship with the Memphis Music Initiative, also called MMI. So the funny thing about that is I originally got connected with MMI via my work with PRIZM because I was seeking funding and support for the work that PRIZM was doing. Mm-hmm. And I was invited to go to some of these meetings in the early stages before it was even called MMI. They were interviewing and having focus groups with nonprofit leaders, students, and musicians, other youth in the city, or different kinds of arts organizations. So they were really just, MMI came in, was just trying to get a sense, to get the lay of the land. And I happened to be at one of these meetings, and the person who ran the program, his name was Darren Isom. He invited me to go to a few more meetings, and we're at this meeting, and he said, well, Lecolion, it sounds like you have some relationships here in the city. We'd like to bring you on as a consultant to help us create a teaching artist fellowship. And so I consulted with them for 3 weeks to write up what this program would look like. Mm-hmm. And then MMI brought me on board to launch the pilot, and then to launch the program itself. And I stayed with them the rest of the time that I was in Memphis. And it was really around just ensuring that everything that deals with MMI has equity-based lenses attached to it, and that it's very comfortable saying that it is, focusing on, black and brown youth in Memphis. And for me, it was very eye-opening having a classical music background, because classical music tends to dog whistle things. We don't always say it. And so to be in this space where those things were being said, especially as a black man who was a classical musician, that was really powerful for me. And it was transformative for me. So that, coupled with this community engagement work, really led me down this path of saying that this work that I do does have an activist slant to it. It is specifically meant to call out certain things, and on some level even disrupt those things intentionally.
Exactly.
Because you call it out, not just for, when you call it out, that's very typical. People will say things that we would love for these things to happen, but there's no activity because it's never been disrupted. And so for me, when I think about that, it's more not just calling the things out, but also saying, well, we're also going to do things, right? We're not going to maintain the status quo, because we're going to call out things. If we see that they are not what we want for the future, then we have to disrupt them and create something else. Exactly.
We're talking to Lecolion Washington, the disruptor, the change agent, the artivist, who is Executive Director of the Community Music Center of Boston, and you're listening to Artivism on the KUDZUKIAN Network. So, Lecolion, we've been talking about this fantastic work you've been doing, and in Artivism, we talk to people much like you who are at that intersection, working at the intersection of arts, and social activism. And wanted to just kind of wrap all of this up, if possible, I think we would need 3 episodes. But tell us a little bit more about how you've been able to take the experience where you really got very deep into becoming a change agent and an artivist in Memphis, and taking that into Boston and applying that to Community Music Center of Boston.
You know, it has been interesting. One of the things that I have had to rethink on my own is just the different dynamics of that exist in Boston. The narratives were a little slightly easier in Memphis because we were talking about essentially an underserved majority, and everyone essentially self-identified as either black and or African American, and that was very, very, very easy, an easy narrative. And for me, it was an easy narrative, saying that, hey, we would like our work to look like or appear or have the same metrics as the city, and that was a narrative that it was easier for me to exist in. Whereas in Boston, it's a little bit different because there are so many. It's so much more diverse. Because whereas in Memphis we had black and white primarily, here even in black it's not the same because you've got Haitians, you've got Dominicans, you've got and they all all the different groups they self-identify not as a group. They're actually quite different, and so one of the things I've been doing lately is just trying to learn about the history of how these different groups self-identify. Because it allows me to be able to say there are some similarities, even though we may self-identify differently. There are some similarities to the way that we relate to different kinds of oppression. And so if we understand it through those, if we can understand the differences, but then also understand the similarities, then we'll be better off. So at the Music Center, we just created or just finished administering a racial equity survey.
Oh,
just
wow.
to learn more. Just to learn more about our own organization. And it was very eye-opening because I think that the organization learned a lot about itself during that process. And then those sorts of things are very uncomfortable. And there's nothing, on some level, just to be honest, there's nothing less fun than being the black ED who walks in and the first thing that happens is this racial equity assessment. But it was something that was put in motion before I even got here. I kind of arrived on the back end of that work. That was a part of a grant that they'd received before. But now we get to go back and look at that data, and we can start to have and make data-based decisions based on what we know to be true about our own organization. And so I'm really excited about finalizing getting those results because we'll be able to then frame conversations around cultural competency and equity-based lenses and what does it mean to be inclusive. We can actually frame them around this data that we have, which I think is quite rare. And so I'm really lucky to be in a space, even though it's not, from a board and staff perspective, not super diverse. It's also an organization that's saying, well, we want to represent the cities and the communities that we serve. There's some things we need to understand. And the organization was proactive about that. And so that's great. And also, it's great for the Music Center overall because we have so many. It's a large organization, relatively speaking. We have pieces of the Music Center all over Boston. And so most of the communities, even though Boston, like most American cities, is very segregated, the Music Center is actually in all these different communities. So we actually have a unique opportunity to be able to be a uniter because we are connected to all these different communities. So one of the things I'm going to be working on over the course of my tenure here is how do we ensure that our space can act as a bridge between different communities.
Great. You've been listening to Artivism on the KUDZUKIAN Network. I'm Linda Steele, your host, and I've been talking to Lecolion Washington, Executive Director of the Community Music Center of Boston. When we return, we will continue talking to Lecolion about his hopes and dreams for the Community Music Center of Boston.
Artivism on the KUDZUKIAN Network. Riffin' on Jazz.
I think I know a lot about jazz, like a lot.
It's only what you've been doing the last 30-some years.
Yeah,
right?
I know.
A voice that can make you laugh and make you cry.
Good jazz, you don't have to worry about what they're talking about. But when they pick up those instruments, we all speak the same language. And don't you know you went in the kitchen and come back with a big bowl of salads?
Riffin' on Jazz on the KUDZUKIAN Network.
You're listening to Artivism. Artivism features conversations with artists, creatives, and citizens working at the intersection of art and social activism. And I'm Linda Steele, your host. I'm a grant maker, change maker, social venture capitalist, and I invest in individuals and projects that use the arts as a vehicle for social change. Welcome back, listeners. You're listening to Artivism on the KUDZUKIAN Network. I'm your host, Linda Steele, and we've been talking to Lecolion Washington, Executive Director of the Community Music Center of Boston in Boston, Massachusetts. And we've been talking a little bit about Lecolion's work at the Community Music Center of Boston. I was really interested in this racial equity assessment and the data that you're about to receive, which is going to help you with a number of programs and initiatives. Can you talk to us a little bit more about how that's going?
Well, it was an interesting, period of time as we were going through it because I thought a lot about it. And the last thing you want, depending on what the makeup of an organization is and what the history is, you can do certain things and they can be well-intentioned, but depending on the audience, they can view it as an attack. And so I've tried to be, organizationally, to try to be very thoughtful to that, especially with not only the climate of, changing. It's this period of change here with a new executive director, but not only is he a new executive director, but he is also a person of color and also a black man. And so that is going to shift a dynamic as well. I think that it should be comfortable being candid about that.
Now, Lecolion, as I recall, you told me that your predecessor was there for 35 years or so? 30,
yeah. He was with the organization for 36, and he was executive director for 34.
Wow.
So, there are certain things that happen, when someone's been around for that long. I mean, again, I know it because I just left an organization that I was the founder of the organization, and I can already see that it's going to be a completely different organization with the new executive director. I think it's going to be a wonderful organization, but it's going to be different because that's why you bring in a new executive director. They have a different vision. They have the same idea, but they may have they want to live inside the mission more often than not, but they may have a different perspective on how it manifests itself in the community. And so, but he had been, the executive director here, his name was David Lapin. He'd been around for a long time, and he really built this place. It was one organization when he arrived and something much larger and had a much larger footprint when he left than it did when he took over in the early 80s. And so, I give a lot of credit, of course, to him for me being able to walk into a position where the organization is stable, we're in really good shape, and so I'm able to have conversations about a racial equity survey, and I'm able to have strategic planning conversations because we're not trying to keep the lights on every day, which is the typical environment for a nonprofit.
Especially arts nonprofit. Right.
Yeah, it's just kind of how it is, unless you are a legacy organization or you have an angel funder who has endowed everything in your organization. Those are the realities of it. But I actually have some space right now with the organization to be able to do some legitimate thinking, to think about what we're going to be in the 21st century. What kind of 21st century organization are we going to be? Which is good. It's nice to be able to walk in the door and be able to have that conversation.
Do you have a sense yet of the funding community, the foundations there, the Arts Council? how are they accepting your leadership and vision, and is some support, financial support, going to follow?
I do feel that what I have felt, and it could be me being, relatively Pollyanna about my experience here, but what I have felt is that the wind is at my back. Not only with the staff here at the Music Center, not only with the board, but also as I've gone out into the community and met with organization leaders, as I've met with foundation leaders, I really feel that I can really feel what the legacy of the Music Center has been. I mean, it is a legacy organization here in Boston. It's 110 years old. So it's an organization that, as the city was thinking about and building certain pieces of music and music education, it was building some of those things based on some of the work that the Music Center was doing. So we're in a unique position, I think, to be able to be a model, I think. And I'm hoping that we will continue to do that. And what we're thinking about doing in the future, just to full disclosure, I've only been here for 3 months. So there's only so much of a 20-year plan you can have thought out in 3 months. But there are some things that I notice. There are some very unique assets, particularly unique combination of assets that the Music Center has. There are some communities in which we have wonderful relationships that I believe that we'll be able to galvanize into a real, I think a real process and real pathways and bridges from one piece of our work into other pieces of our work. So I really feel that we'll be able to not only create our own thriving ecosystem, but also hopefully be able to help to support the entire arts and arts education ecosystem through our work as well.
That's fantastic. You've been listening to Artivism on the KUDZUKIAN Network, and I'm Linda Steele, your host, and my guest today is musician, artivist, activist, Lecolion Washington, Executive Director of the Community Music Center of Boston. And we've been talking about Lecolion's hopes and dreams and plans for the Community Center of Boston. When we come back, we'll finish up and learn a little bit more about updates from Lecolion and what his plans are in the future.
Artivism on the KUDZUKIAN Network.
Hey, this is your guy, DC, Funky Politics. We're back. A brand new season, brand new shows, brand new guests. We're going to do it just right here on the KUDZUKIAN Network.
Welcome back to Artivism. I'm your host, Linda Steele, and you're listening to Artivism on the KUDZUKIAN Network. My guest today is Lecolion Washington, the Executive Director of the Community Music Center of Boston, and we've been discussing some of his hopes and dreams for the Community Music Center of Boston. And now that we're finishing up our conversation today, I wanted to ask you, Lecolion, so you've been talking about the Community Music Center and your hopes and dreams. Can you tell us a little bit more, if listeners are really interested in CMCB, how can they find out more? How can they support you and the work that you're doing? How can they follow you? Tell us a little bit more about getting in touch with CMCB.
Sure. The website is www.cmcb.org. And that is, you can find out all the things, I think, to be able to support the Music Center. I think that, and thank you for asking me that question, because that is something I do believe that as the Music Centers, where we are right now, a year from now, we're going to, I believe, become a national model for the future of programs like ours. So one of the things we'll be looking at is being able to receive not only local but also national support for our work, because I really believe that we have the potential to be a model for how the 21st century community music school could and maybe potentially should be thinking about how they're going to continue to be relevant in the 21st century. And so that is for sure. So thank you for asking me that. I also want to share one thing,
Yes.
and that's one of the things I always forget to share, is that I was a musician first. I talked all this time about this community engagement work and all this work I've been doing in the community, but all of that began through my love of not only just listening to music, but my love of being a musician, traveling and being on those stages and being able to work with some of the best musicians in the world. That was my career before I made this pivot. And even I, on some level, forget that that was my life before, because I've been so heavily invested in this work that I just forget. But I do like to remind people that I did have a 20-year career as a performing musician, and I wasn't just playing at my Aunt Tussie's church. I mean, I was actually doing. I was a legit musician, so I would say Google it. But then I also realized that I was a product of a lot of help. There were a lot of people who paved roads for me. Mm-hmm. My first bassoon was bought by a patron.
Wow.
So someone gave $8,000 to help me buy my first bassoon. I had two, and so someone gave me the other 8. And that woman made me promise that if I ever had the opportunity to do that for someone else, that I would do it. And I have been spending my entire, I think, post-performance career trying to pay it forward, because there were a lot of people who paved ways for me. I'm not smart. I'm not the most talented. I think I am smart. I think I have some talent. But I also had some people who paved some ways for me, and I want to be one of those people who's paving ways for others as well.
That's great. If you didn't mention it, I was going to mention it, that you are the perfect person to really transform the Community Music Center of Boston into that national, even global model, because you've been performed all over the world, as well as been involved in the arts and education, as well as the community engagement and equity and access process in music and arts education. So if you didn't say it, I was going to give you the plug.
Yeah, I mean, I just my last thing is that I live this work. This is not my gig. It's not my hustle. I live this work. I have 2 sons who
yes.
I know are going to grow up in the world, and I want them to grow up in a world in which people have value, and everyone knows that everyone has value, and that people have access to things, and that everyone who has these gifts, that they're sharing them. And so I want my boys to see their dad doing that, and I want them to do that, and I want to hopefully be a catalyst for other people doing it also.
Well, thank you, Lecolion. It's been a pleasure every time. And for everyone, you've been listening to Artivism on the KUDZUKIAN Network. I'm Linda Steele, your host, and I've been talking to musician, artivist, change agent, Lecolion Washington, the executive director of the Community Music Center of Boston. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda.
You will find the Artivism podcast at the intersection of art and social activism. Artivism is executive produced by ArtUp, hosted by Linda Steele, produced, directed, and distributed by KUDZUKIAN.